To you about a new law that would bring big changes to the workplace, but there are also several new laws that will impact public safety.
This case because this law has posed substantial threats to public safety.
Yeah, we're talking about new laws on all kinds of matters, from guns to emergency alerts.
The other accessory that goes with the firearm, and for the government to tell us that we can't have this brace.
Thomas shifts gun landscape. Justice Clarence Thomas' role in the recent Supreme Court decision has indeed opened the door for significant challenges to arms safety laws across the United States. In the 6-3 decision, the court struck down a particular type of arm carry restriction that was followed by only 6 states. This ruling, while specific to the case at hand, has broader implications as it changes the legal landscape surrounding arm regulations. The key element in Justice Thomas's opinion lies in the shift of the standard used to analyze the constitutionality of arm regulations. He asserted that only regulations consistent with this nation's historical tradition are in compliance with the Second Amendment's protections. This new benchmark poses a significant threat to a wide range of arms safety laws that lack historical parallels to the nation's founding. The decision's immediate impact is on the cases already in progress, where courts will now need to adjust their approach based on the altered standards set by Justice Thomas. This adjustment raises the threshold that governments must overcome when defending their arms safety laws. It essentially provides a legal opening for challenges against various regulations that may have been considered constitutional under previous standards. The ripple effect of this decision is expected to prompt a surge in new legal challenges across the country. Arm rights proponents, armed with the Supreme Court's decision, will likely push more aggressive arguments for why specific restrictions should be struck down. This could lead to a flurry of legal battles over a range of arms safety laws, as advocates seek to capitalize on the court's reinterpretation of the Second Amendment. The impact of this decision extends beyond the specific public carry laws, such as the one in New York, that were directly addressed in the case. Virtually any form of arm regulation, including age-based restrictions, limitations on certain types of arms, and controls on high-capacity mags will now face heightened scrutiny from the courts. The historical tradition test introduced by Justice Thomas creates a more challenging environment for justifying the constitutionality of these regulations. One potential consequence of the shift is that governments may find themselves engaged in more protracted legal battles to defend their arms safety laws. The burden of proof has effectively been raised, making it more difficult for authorities to demonstrate that a given regulation aligns with the historical tradition outlined by Justice Thomas. This could result in a prolonged period of legal uncertainty as courts grapple with the implications of the new standard. Moreover, the decision has the potential to shape the future development of arms safety laws. Legislators and policymakers may now approach the drafting of new regulations with a heightened awareness of the historical context, attempting to align them more closely with the nation's founding principles to avoid legal challenges. In decision, Justice Clarence Thomas's pivotal role in the recent Supreme Court decision has altered the legal landscape surrounding arm regulations. The introduction of a historical tradition test significantly raises the bar for the constitutionality of arms safety laws, making various regulations vulnerable to legal challenges. The decision's impact extends beyond the immediate case, setting the stage for a wave of legal battles and influencing the future development of arms safety legislation in the United States. Thomas redefines arm regulation. The aftermath of the District of Columbia v. Heller case in 2008, a pivotal Supreme Court ruling that affirmed an individual's right to bear arms under the Second Amendment, a legal framework had emerged to assess the constitutionality of arm regulations. This framework involved a two-step approach that appeals courts across the country had adopted. The first step involved determining whether the regulated activity fell within the scope of conduct protected by the Second Amendment. If it did, the courts proceeded to the second step, where they assessed whether the means of regulation were justified by the intended ends. This two-step approach became widely accepted in lower courts, providing a structured method for analyzing the constitutional implications of various arm control measures. However, Justice Clarence Thomas challenged this established approach in a recent opinion. In the wake of the Supreme Court's landmark decision in Heller, which emphasized the individual's right to bear arms, Thomas agreed that the two-step process had become overly complicated. In a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court sided with Thomas, marking a significant departure from the previous legal framework. Thomas, in his opinion, criticized the two-step approach, deeming it one step too many.
About a new law that would bring big changes to the workplace, but there are also several new laws that will impact public safety.
The Supreme Court heard both sides of the argument for the Second Amendment Preservation Act. On one side,
predisposed to put criminals in jail, and finally, liberal district attorneys.
This case because this law has posed substantial threats to public safety.
This shift in the legal landscape is expected to have far-reaching consequences. Cases currently in progress will undergo a re-evaluation as courts adjust their approach to align with the new standards set by the Supreme Court. The ruling not only affects the specific arm carry restriction at the center of this case, but also opens the door for challenges to a wide array of arms safety laws. Now, any arm regulation, from public carry laws to restrictions on certain arm types and high-capacity mags, will face heightened scrutiny. The historical tradition test introduced by Thomas creates a more stringent standard for the constitutionality of such regulations, potentially setting the stage for a wave of legal challenges across the country. In supposition, the Supreme Court's recent decision, led by Justice Clarence Thomas, marks a significant departure from the established two-step approach in evaluating the constitutionality of arm regulations. Thomas's call for a more stringent historical tradition test places a greater burden on the government to prove the alignment of its arm regulations with the nation's founding principles. This shift is poised to impact ongoing cases and may usher in a new era of legal challenges to various armed safety laws, fundamentally altering the landscape of Second Amendment jurisprudence. Historical lens on arms. Justice Clarence Thomas's recent assertion, redefining the scrutiny courts must apply to modern arms regulations, emphasizes a rigorous historical perspective. In a 6-3 Supreme Court decision, Thomas argued that courts are obligated to evaluate whether contemporary arm laws align with both the text and historical understanding of the Second Amendment. Thomas introduced a critical element in this evaluation: the historical inquiry into the societal problems addressed by the regulation. If a modern arm law addresses a problem that existed in the 18th century, it is considered evidence that the law may be unconstitutional if there was no comparable regulation at the time. Additionally, Thomas emphasized that if historical solutions to a societal problem involved regulations different from those currently under scrutiny, it serves as evidence of potential unconstitutionality. This approach demands a meticulous historical examination by courts, requiring them to delve into the circumstances and regulations of the 18th century. Thomas contends that this historical inquiry often involves reasoning by analogy, a standard practice for lawyers and judges. Analogical reasoning, in this context, requires determining the relevance and similarity between historical regulations and distinctly modern arm regulations. For instance, if a contemporary law aims to address a societal problem that was present in the 18th century, the court must assess whether there was a historical analog to that specific regulation during that period. If such historical analogs are absent or significantly different, Thomas argues that the modern law may be deemed unconstitutional.
Yeah, we're talking about new laws on all kinds of matters, from guns to emergency alerts.
Fighting people who are simply exercising their constitutional rights and doing nothing about the criminals.
Community, local, state, or federal, that I talked to that said that this was the type of law.
The other accessory that goes with the firearm, and for the government to tell us that we can't have this brace.
This emphasis on historical relevance serves as a guide for judges and lawyers in determining the appropriateness of regulations in light of the Second Amendment. Critics argue that this historical inquiry may introduce complexities and subjectivity into the evaluation process. Determining the relevance and similarity between historical regulations and present-day arm laws involves a nuanced judgment, potentially leading to varied interpretations by different courts. Additionally, opponents expressed concerns about the potential limitation on contemporary lawmakers' ability to address evolving societal challenges with new regulations. In decision, Justice Clarence Thomas's insistence on a comprehensive historical inquiry marks a significant shift in the evaluation of modern arms regulations. The emphasis on historical understanding requires courts to assess whether present-day laws align with the text and traditions of the Second Amendment. This approach places a heavier burden on the government to prove the historical legitimacy of its regulations, potentially shaping a more stringent standard of the constitutionality of contemporary arm laws. While it provides a precise framework for evaluation, critics argue that it introduces complexities and may limit the adaptability of regulations to address evolving societal challenges. Historical consistency in jeopardy. The recent Supreme Court ruling led by Justice Clarence Thomas has far-reaching consequences that put various arm laws in jeopardy across the United States. The decision establishes a stringent standard for the constitutionality of arm laws, demanding consistency with historical regulations. This shift has implications for existing and future laws at both the state and federal levels. The ruling implies that, moving forward, any court assessing the constitutionality of an arm law will need to ensure its alignment with historical practices of regulating arms. If a law lacks a historical parallel, especially in addressing long-standing societal problems, it is likely to face legal challenges. This raises concerns for states and localities attempting to enact arm laws that diverge from historical norms, potentially rendering such laws vulnerable to legal scrutiny. The impact of the ruling extends to cases already in the pipeline, including challenges to California's ban on high-capacity mags, Maryland's ban on assault weapons, and a federal bump stock ban instituted by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Arms, and Explosives during the Trump administration. These cases, now subject to the new legal standard, may be considered by the Supreme Court or sent back to lower courts with instructions to re-evaluate them in light of the recent ruling. The New York decision is anticipated to influence ongoing cases, such as a California case where a prohibition on individuals under 21 purchasing certain semi-auto weapons was struck down by a conservative-leaning Ninth Circuit panel. The ruling's impact on this case and others could set precedents for future legal challenges, shaping the interpretation of the Second Amendment in the context of historical regulations. Furthermore, the ruling may cast a shadow over the federal arms safety package that Congress is contemplating. If and when Congress passes modest arms safety measures, these laws could be subject to legal challenges under the new, less generous test introduced by the conservative justices. This potential legal scrutiny adds an extra layer of complexity to legislative efforts aimed at addressing arms safety concerns.
The same level of attention and media, as well as law enforcement, is not dedicated when a young African American.
In June of 2021, you changed the department's asylum rules so that it could apply to individuals with significant gang violence.
Most apparent here a defense of the Second Amendment, which this most certainly is.
In most public places, even with the concealed carry permit, is now in effect, even as the case makes its way through the courts.
The ruling's effects also extend to long-standing laws that may now face new lawsuits fortified by the conservative justices' more restrictive interpretation. Even laws that have been in place for over a century, like the New York law struck down by the Supreme Court, could be revisited under the altered legal landscape. The ruling challenges the endurance of existing arm regulations, prompting a re-evaluation of their constitutionality based on the historical traditions outlined by the court. In decision, the Supreme Court's recent decision fundamentally alters the legal landscape surrounding arm laws in the United States. The requirement for historical consistency places a considerable burden on both existing and future regulations. The ruling's impact is felt not only in ongoing cases, but also extends to potential challenges against federal legislation and the revisiting of long-existing laws. This shift signals a new era of legal scrutiny for arm laws, posing challenges for lawmakers and stakeholders navigating the evolving terrain of Second Amendment jurisprudence. Sensitive places analysis. Justice Clarence Thomas's recent opinion has implications for the constitutionality of restrictions on bringing arms into sensitive places. In the context of the New York law on public carry, defenders cited concerns about sensitive places as a justification for imposing limits. Thomas's opinion delves into the historical considerations surrounding such restrictions, providing insights into how courts might view them in the future. Thomas acknowledges the historical precedent for restrictions on bringing arms into certain sensitive places in the 18th and 19th centuries. Examples he provides include legislative assemblies, polling places, and courthouses. In these instances, arms carrying was altogether prohibited, and there were no recorded disputes about the lawfulness of such prohibitions. According to Thomas, the historical record establishes that these locations were considered sensitive places where limitations on arms carrying were consistent with the Second Amendment. However, Thomas introduces a nuanced perspective by suggesting that regulations extending beyond these historical parallels may raise constitutional concerns. The opinion implies that while certain places historically justified restrictions, expanding the category of sensitive places to encompass all public congregations not isolated from law enforcement might be overly broad. This introduces a potential limitation on the extent to which modern regulations can be justified under the historical understanding of sensitive places. The opinion raises questions about the breadth of the definition of sensitive places. Thomas argues that extending this category to include all places of public congregation where law enforcement is generally available goes beyond the historical context and might be constitutionally problematic. This challenges the idea of a one-size-fits-all approach to sensitive places, emphasizing the need for a more nuanced consideration of historical parallels. Additionally, Thomas's opinion declines to resolve a scholarly debate regarding the timeline that courts should consider when analyzing the historical context around modern arm laws. The debate centers on whether courts should focus on 1791, the birth date of the Second Amendment, or 1868, the ratification date of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is crucial because it extended constitutional protections to the states. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, in a solo concurrence, weighs in on this debate. Supporting the earlier date of 1791, she asserts that the recent decision should not be interpreted as endorsing a freewheeling reliance on historical practice from the mid to late 19th century to establish the original meaning of the Bill of Rights. Barrett's concurrence emphasizes the importance of considering the original meaning of the Second Amendment, rooted in its inception in 1791. Dissent questions historical approach. Justice Clarence Thomas's opinion, emphasizing a historical approach to interpret the Second Amendment, has triggered dissent from liberal justices, particularly Justice Stephen Breyer. Breyer, in his dissent, raises question about the practicality and legality of the history-only approach advocated by Thomas and the majority, highlighting potential challenges and ambiguities that may arise in its application. Breyer begins his dissent by critiquing what he refers to as the historical-only approach, arguing that it is both legally flawed and fraught with practical problems. He asserts that laws addressing ancient weapons, such as repeating crossbows, lansgays, dirks, dags, skeins, and other archaic arms offer little guidance in addressing contemporary issues. Breyer contends that as technological progress propels society beyond the framers' imaginations, attempting analogical reasoning based solely on historical context become increasingly challenging.
I want to be clear, this wasn't based on violence. This is based on threats specifically to individuals, on gangs.
We can expect in the future that more people will be carrying handguns.
Types of disputes that would be settled by people yelling at each other, maybe engaging in a fist fight, are being settled with guns.
Because people buy hundreds of guns legally and then they sell them illegally.
Moreover, Breyer questions the majority's examples of historically consistent sensitive places, such as legislative assemblies, polling places, and courthouses. He raises the crucial query of how these historical examples apply to modern venues like subways, nightclubs, movie theaters, and sports stadiums. The dissent highlights the court's silence on these critical contemporary spaces, leaving a gap in the practical application of the historical approach to the Second Amendment. Breyer expresses concerns about the research resources required for such an approach, emphasizing the challenges judges would face in sifting through historical records to establish the constitutionality of contemporary arm regulations. The dissent also points to the potential for judicial bias, as the majority's approach seemingly allows judges to selectively embrace or reject historical evidence to support their preferred outcomes. In essence, Breyer's dissent challenges the viability of a strict historical approach to interpreting the Second Amendment. He argues that this method is ill-suited to address the complexities of modern society and may result in an impractical, subjective, and potentially biased application of constitutional principles. The dissent serves as a reminder of the ongoing debates within the legal community about how best to interpret the Second Amendment and balance individual rights with the evolving needs of contemporary society. California concealed carry controversy. A recent development in California related to concealed carry laws, particularly the implementation of SB 2, which could potentially lead to a statewide ban on concealed carry. The speaker expresses concern about what they perceive as a violation of the Second Amendment and criticizes the Ninth Circuit's decision to grant an administrative stay, allowing the new law to take effect. The controversy centers around the May v. Bonta case, where plaintiffs, including the speaker, challenged SB 2, a new law that places additional restrictions on concealed carry permits. A preliminary injunction was granted by a federal district court judge, Judge Cormac Carney, against certain aspects of SB 2. However, the state of California appealed and sought an emergency stay to fully implement the law. Dissatisfaction with the Ninth Circuit's motions panel, which maintained that the emergency stay request was not adequately addressed when an administrative stay was granted. The administrative stay temporarily halts Judge Carney's injunction, allowing SB 2 to take effect unless further Ninth Circuit intervention occurs. The perceived lack of courage by the motions panel is not directly addressing the emergency stay request. They argue that the administrative stay essentially renders concealed carry permits useless, as the new law imposes strict restrictions, making it difficult to legally carry concealed arms in the state. Additionally, concerns are raised about potential corruption within the California legal system and questions the constitutionality of SB 2. They argue that the Ninth Circuit's action may allow the state to violate the Second Amendment and implement unconstitutional restrictions on arm rights. SB 2 risks and challenges. The repercussions of SB 2, a new law in California that brings significant changes to concealed carry regulations. It specifically focuses on amplified training requirements and restrictive location provisions, raising concerns about the potential risks and challenges forced by law-abiding citizens due to these alterations. The SB 2 introduces more rigorous training mandates, extending the class duration for new concealed carry permit applications from 8 to 16 hours and renewals from 4 to 8 hours. The law allows issuing agencies to grant permits if the applicant is not disqualified, essentially requiring a determination of good moral character. This practice is argued to potentially conflict with the precedent set by the Bruin case. A substantial issue brought up pertains to the possible nullification of concealed carry permits under SB 2. The law imposes an exceedingly restrictive concealed carry location restriction, identifying specific sensitive locations and introducing catch-all provisions that make privately owned properties off-limits unless explicitly authorized. This poses practical challenges for permit holders, limiting legal concealed carry options in the state. The list of sensitive locations outlined in SB 2 makes it challenging for permit holders to find legal areas for concealed carry. Even sidewalks may have restrictions, and the inclusion of catch-all provisions further complicates the interpretation of where carrying is allowed. The potential legal consequences for individuals inadvertently violating these restrictions highlights the risk of criminal charges and, more critically, the potential threat to personal safety. Individuals who have undergone the legal concealed carry permit process may now face dilemmas due to the restrictive provisions of SB 2. The difficulty of these choices puts them at risk of legal repercussions or compromises their ability to defend themselves and their families. The seriousness of the situation is underscored, pointing out that millions of people in California may be at risk of violating SB 2 and facing legal consequences. The potential danger extends beyond legal consequences, as individuals may be placed in situations where self-defense becomes challenging due to the restrictive provisions of the new law. That's all for this video, folks. See you next time.